Hello and welcome to On Landscape. Any questions? I'm here with our regular host, Joe Cornish,
Hi,
and
Jim.
our guest, Morag Patterson. Hi, Joe and Morag.
Hi, Tim. Hi, Joe. Good to see
Hi,
you both.
Morag.
We've
Hi.
got, as usual, a bunch of questions from readers, but we're also interested in talking about quite a few things with Morag, as mentioned in our email that went out recently. Firstly, I'd like to ask Morag what she's been up to recently. I believe you haven't updated the website, so it might be news for people.
Yes, well, recently I've been doing quite a bit of work collaborating with people around forests. So I've got a kind of year-long residency, self-directed residency, working with a particular forester called Andrew McQueen in a forest he manages in Moffat. And so with that, we've been doing a lot of microscope work. So taking one of the kind of practical examples of what we've done is make settle plates, which is a kind of petri dish with a kind of catching goo, to use the simple phrase, and a nutrient in it, and to see what's floating around in the air, the kind of aerobiome of the forest, and then let that grow for a few days or a few weeks, and then go and look at it under the microscope in the lab and photograph it. So that's the kind of the most recent. And
I
a
did
bit
see
early.
I saw the microscope work on the website. Was it Instagram or Facebook? I can't
Oh,
remember.
yeah, because I did get them on Instagram, I think. Yeah,
Yeah, looked
I
quite cool.
managed to do that.
Is this looking at fungus or
Yeah,
anything?
it's whatever's in the air basically, but that does seem to be either fungi or bacteria on the whole. Yep, and you can kind of tell the difference.
What sort of magnifications are you working at?
I'm going up to a lab in Edinburgh, which is an incredible place called Ascus, which does arts and science collaborations. I think the highest magnification is 100 times. I'm not much of an expert on the microscopes yet, but I'm pretty sure that's the furthest round optic. But there's two different types. You have the stereo microscopes, don't you, and then the binocular ones. So
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask you a question about that because I did put it in the email about the microscope work, and I'm intrigued as how you feel about the creative part of that in terms of because microscopes are scientific instruments, but they are just cameras at the end of the day.
yeah,
So,
for sure.
what flexibility do you have, and how have you been approaching that?
So far, I haven't been manipulating anything on the plates, as it were, and the slides in any more than you would just to prepare it as a sort of scientific
Yeah,
trial. And I think that's mainly at this stage because I've just been so excited by
yeah,
what I see there. You know, I see the slide or I see the plate, even not looking in a microscope, and then look at it in the microscope, and then I'm just so blown away that I'm not going any further than just taking the photo of it at the moment. And none of those are processed any more than, you know, a little tiny process that were on Instagram. But of course, there is opportunity there with a bit more time and a fair wind to be working with that in a bit more depth.
that'd be really
Um,
interesting. Yeah,
yeah, it's so fascinating, and it needs quite a lot of time. Like, I mean, before we started on this one, where we were collecting from the air, we did took roots and we're doing mycorrhiza. So and then you make a preparation for that where you need to put it in potassium hydroxide for a certain amount of time because you need to clean the roots. If you over clean them, you don't see anything. So you've kind of stripped it all away. If you don't clean them enough, you can't see anything. And then you stain it. So with a tends to be a blue or a purple dye
yeah,
so that
yeah.
they show up on the plates. And the first time I went into the lab, I'd collected like a carrier bag full of stuff from two different sites in his forest. And then when you get to prepping your slides, you realize you're dealing with taking
Yeah.
something that's the size of the tip of your fingernail. And even then, with a full day booked, a full day for prep and a full day for looking at the things under the microscopes, there was nowhere near enough time to feel like you looked at everything and saw it and were able to kind of be able to process the sort of magnitude of those tiny worlds going on. So
I mean, I just think that's just the most fascinating account that you've given us there because it also sparks off so many different ways of thinking about how photography can be used to either amplify, emphasize, or interpret something that we can't see. I mean, and if we take the opposite example, we see quite a lot coming back from the James Webb Space Telescope now, don't we? And as far as I understand it, all of those, or many of the colors will be kind of enhanced. Quite simply, they're outside of the visible spectrum anyway. And yet for us to really encounter them, to experience them, we have to see them in some color or other. And then it's really, I suppose, to some extent down to the interpretation of the scientists using their artistic skills, to bring out the wonder of the universe. And in a way, you could be doing the same. And you're at an early stage, as you're saying, but it does sort of make me feel it's incredibly exciting. I'm not saying one should Disneyfy the colors that you're looking at, but the way that you translate the colors and the tones could be very significant in how it helps us to understand what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the textures and the shapes as well as the color. And also, I think, because there's been a lot of conversation about the whole, I suppose you could call it Disneyfication or humanification of the Wood Wide Web, as it were, when it comes to mycorrhiza. But, at the end of the day, so many people, more people are engaged with that subject now and have awareness of it because of that. So although there's some very purists saying that was ridiculous, it went too far, there's a lot of people saying, well, actually, hang on a minute, like a lot of people are engaged with that now. And that what people knowing about soil and fungi and the kind of microbiology of all of that is so important. So
Well, we accepted black and white photography. We still do accept black and white photography,
yeah.
which inherently abstracts the world away. Gets rid of the difficult colors of the kind of grungy colors, let's say, and almost like purifies the world. Nobody objects to that.
No.
I think it's really a question of intent, and it probably lead us all the way back, Tim, to the natural landscape photographer of the year if we're not careful. But
I was going to mention that because it wasn't the natural landscape, but it's a wildlife photographer of the year awards where there are regularly microscope entries, and they do clever things like use UV spectroscopy or mono wavelength light to try and simulate reactions or combine to exaggerate colors, etc. And we did have a few conversations about, is this real? Same thing about using UV to stimulate responses in fungus or scorpions or things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big wide world of possibilities there, isn't it? I haven't, I'm just using the very straightforward lab equipment at the moment and what's there, because I suppose the other part of the creativity of the project and the importance of it is the amount of time spent in the forest and the conversations and the thinking. This idea came out of a lot of conversation and a lot of walking and talking in the forest, so a lot of it's in the process and the gathering and the thinking, as well as the photograph. So and we haven't had time. We photographed that first batch of results, but we haven't had time to process them. We haven't had time to Google Lens them and go to experts and ask, what are we looking at here? What might each of those things mean? What does it do? What's its function in the ecosystem? And then we have no idea where those conversations lead us, which is really nice. It's to have a residency with such free reign like that is incredible. That your outcome is made by the walking, basically.
I was stunned by the amount of fungus, because when I was doing my mountain leader training, one of the things I thought I'd look at was funguses and lichens, etc. I realised when I started looking at lichens, there was something like, I think it was 4,000 Scottish lichens. It's like that's the surface ones, one representative of one subclass of fungi.
Yeah, it's staggering, isn't it? We started to scratch the surface of that during lockdown. Did some courses on mosses and lichens, and then listening to podcasts about that relationship between fungi and algae and all the rest of it, and whether those things, whether they become a compound new thing. I believe they can split apart again, can't they? They don't become assimilated into a permanently changed structure. And then that just, my mind just goes like this. Wow, there's so much to look at there.
It's great to hear your sense of, that you've got that sense of wonder about what you're looking at. And, I think ultimately, when it comes to, if you choose to publish the work or put it in the public domain, to allow your kind of artistic instincts to be at the fore. I'm pretty sure that if you do decide to, to write with it as well, that's going to help. I mean, not that the work won't be more than interesting enough in its own right visually, but clearly the stories behind, especially just hearing you talk about walking through the forest and what you experienced there, and then somehow using these sort of highly powerful scientific instruments to go to another level within the world that it's invisible below the surface. I mean, I just think it's terrifically exciting. And for me, it's always been the biggest problem really with the World Wide Web is the fact, or the Wood Wide Web rather, is the fact that we can't see it. So finding ways of kind of visually accounting for its wonder or expressing it is going to be valuable culturally as well as enjoyable artistically.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, I hope it will be. I mean, we're already starting to do little pieces of writing and visuals about the project as we go along. For kind of things that I wouldn't normally be working with as a photographer, like the Forestry Journal. So a publication that's entirely read by foresters and commercial foresters. And a whole wide range of foresters. So it's interesting then working as well it's the interdisciplinary kind of part of it as well. I think that really helps feed that kind of creativeness and the enthusiasm. Because Andrew will say something that just it leads me off down so many.
It can't help but feed into your photography, your normal photography either.
Yeah.
As soon as you've learnt all that information, you just look at things differently. You can't help that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things we'll do at some point before the summer probably is try and do some sort of participatory event there in the forest as well. Some kind of walk and talk. We don't know what that'll look like yet, so we're still creating as we go, kind of thing.
Well, I should move on to some of the questions we've had asked. I'm going to start with one from Tony Martin, if I can read it on my phone, because my eyesight's not particularly great. I would be interested in asking the panel, that's us, by the way, the following. If you're unable to ever show your work to anyone ever again, would you carry on making your work? I guess I'm really asking for their thoughts on the drivers for the work being a balance of communication versus self-expression, which obviously varies. How does that sound, Morag?
Yeah, I would, because I think I probably alluded to it just now. So much of it is about the process for me these days. Like the end result is nice and it's great to show it to people and have a nice response, a reaction, or a conversation. But I'd say for me it's 75% process and only 25% the end result. I think it's always hard to say something like that because I might feel completely different in 2 years and I might have felt different 2 years ago. But that's, I think, where I am now.
There was a very good story told by a friend of ours of going on a holiday to America, a photographic holiday, and they took a large format camera with a bunch of quick slides and spent maybe 2 weeks taking pictures, having the time of their life, and coming back and finding out that the quick holder wasn't working. So she hadn't actually exposed any film whatsoever.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing was she still had a fantastic time, loved the process, still remembered all the photographs that were taken. And I thought that was a great example of separating the product from the process and what it gives you.
Yeah, great example.
If I can jump in, because I also want to hear what your view on it is, Tim. But as a really good answer from Morag, I definitely, the longer time goes on, the more true that is for me. That I just am more than happy just going out with my camera. I mean, I just think that is the it's really like 90% of it. In fact, now that I don't have a gallery, I don't have to worry about anybody else, actually, apart from me. Yes, it's nice to show work, and it's nice to get good feedback, and you feel a certain you can be useful to people by showing your work and talking about it, and that's a kind of duty in a way. But without a doubt, the only reason for me to take pictures is because I love taking pictures, even if there were no other reason for it. It helps me to kind of center myself, I think, on being alive in the moment and out in nature. These are sort of words and phrases and ideas I might not have used 25 years ago, but as time goes by and you do more education and whatnot, you realize that what you're really doing is doing something you love. And we're incredibly privileged on the whole to do photography. It's one of the I mean, it's a modern, on the face of it, a modern thing, relatively speaking, in human history. And yet the fact that it gives you a kind of permission to go out and study the world around you. You don't have to kill an animal or anything like that, in a hunting sense, but you're still kind of using some of the same skills that our ancestors used. And I do think that's something that connects quite deeply, as well as the kind of superficial pleasure of just looking at things for its own sake. So yeah, for me, I love doing it, and doesn't matter whether it gets published or not. And in fact, most of my pictures never see the light of day anyway. And what about you, Mr. Parkin?
It's a good one, because I've done quite a bit of photography over the last 4 years, but I haven't shown much of it to anybody at all, because it's been mostly when I've been out mountaineering or climbing, and I've not done it specifically. It's been record shots, but I can't just take a record shot. It still ends up as a photograph, and that's part of the process. But like you said, Joe, it's something that's been going on beyond photography with the people who did the Grand Tour and doing their sketchbooks, learning to sketch when they were young, or watercolor sketch. They would be doing exactly the same thing as we're doing in terms of wandering around and using the process of looking to alter the way they experience the world. And it's the same way you're talking about learning about the microrhizomes and fungi, that the stuff and the process you use changes the way you interact with the world. I do want to go out and do more photography in terms of classical photography, and I think sharing it is a part of it. But I think, like in that story about the lady who lost her pictures, they're two separate things. Being out and taking the pictures is one thing. Deciding whether or not to share them and how to share them is another thing. And I think separating those two things out like that can be quite helpful, and saying, well, it doesn't matter what you're doing in terms of wandering around and taking pictures. You don't need to think about success or not. It's about interacting. And then when it comes home and you're processing them, then you can decide how to share them, what's useful. I mean, I've had a recent chat with a book publisher and a book shop in Fort William who are asking for a tourist book. And I was thinking, well, that'd be quite nice to do, actually. Wonder if you can do a tourist book and make it creatively interesting at the same time. And so I think that's quite a nice driver. And then again, there's taking pictures. I'd like to do a book of my own work just for the sake of it. So they're all different ways of sharing.
Yeah, you might be able to do both at the same time, Tim. The shot for the book and the shot for you, and then compare the two. It'd be really interesting.
Exactly, I know, and you can have them in little boxes next to each other. I think somebody's done that before.
Have they?
First book. But no, I think I would still be taking pictures. I still would be enjoying it, and I think it'd probably change what I did a little bit. How would it change it? I don't know. I think I'd be going out with a different goal in mind, just to wander instead. So the walking would become the most important thing. And then the photographing.
Because I'll bet, Morag, you obviously have a sense that you must have a sense of purpose and mission in what you do, and clearly, if you take your current project, there's a very, very strict limitation on what you can do. and those limitations sort of set and perhaps give you the energy as well to continue it. And I wonder if I'm just thinking back from my own experience doing books in the past, which in exactly trying to solve the problem that you're describing, Tim, where your client requires an illustration, but you want to do something that you love and that you get excited about, and so in the end, maybe you do two different versions, or more likely, you actually do what you want to do and hope for the best. And that's certainly what I did. Most of the time, it did work out, but I also think that there is something really nice and powerful about having a project, like the one that you described, Morag.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because now you say it, it is limiting in the same way like Zero Footprint was limiting, but with this project, it's just felt hugely expansive for me. Like the possibilities seem huge, even though I suppose there's some constraints and there's some boundaries, isn't there? My only constraint really with that project, because I wouldn't even have to do photography, is place. That's the place and the subject of forest and forest ecology and forest policy and forest management. That's my constraint. So I do have that and a place. But in terms of that kind of what we can explore and the avenues that we can go down, we're wide open. So it's a nice combination of those two things, I think.
I think that's the problem with doing anything and not having any constraints is it's almost a non-understandable infinity of choices.
Yeah. And why am I doing it and where am I going? Yeah.
Whereas if you choose something smaller like the Zero Footprint, it's still an infinite number of choices you can use.
Yeah.
You can start to understand them and engage with it, perhaps.
Yeah, you've given yourself a bit of a boundary and a bit of a framework to work within. Yeah, and then you can just take it forward. But yeah, I mean, I do tend to kind of blow along in the wind with what I do rather than be super intentional, if that makes sense. I mean, you two have known me for quite a long time now and have seen me do a lot of different types of projects. There was the Zero Footprint, and then Tim, I think it was you, when I was doing cyanotypes, pointed me to the anthotype book, which I bought straight away and just got lost in anthotypes of all descriptions for a very long time because they take a long time to make, a long time to expose, and then went on to the point where I was just boiling the plants straight into paper.
Really good results.
Which is an incredible thing. And then dyeing cloth from plants and then tying the plants into cloth. And, so I don't know, it's not, the ideas I have definitely just come out of nowhere or the universe somewhere. They're not something, I never sit down and kind of like really think something through and put the limits and the boundaries. It all just seems to happen quite organically because I
think that's describing the ideal kind of creative process, is to allow yourself to be kind of open to everything that's happening and that you perceive in the world, and not to shut doors, and to be in a kind of state of flow. I know that's a bit of a cliche now, but I mean that is the ideal. I actually think that certainly for me in the past, having projects and let's say commercial obligations was creatively quite limiting, and I used to get bogged down in that. Whereas I think it's really lovely if you can just allow yourself to be open to any possibility, and also it means you're more likely to be productive, but perhaps more to the point, you're more likely to be expressive, actually find ways of making a point that will actually probably resonate for others as well, rather than it being forced or kind of formulaic. So, I mean, it sounds great.
Yeah,
Have you worked with any scientific people? I mean, it's like I'm thinking of Morag, obviously, but I'm also thinking of Colin Pryor's work with the egg specialists and bird specialists. And you've worked with geologists, did you at one point?
I haven't. I mean, I know. Well, my son is a sort of geologist, I suppose, and I have done had quite a lot of collaborations with geologists, but only quite superficially in the past. I got a friend who's an atmospheric scientist, who's looking to do some collaboration, and that's super exciting. I mean, I just think that the collaboration was one of the things that I was proposing we discuss with Morag, who's obviously an absolute expert in it. But it's also one of those things that that opens up photography for you. I wish I could tell you I'd done some fantastically scientific things, but I haven't. I still think that I'd like to work with my son on a book project, because actually, although Sam is he's basically a climate scientist, but he's just a brilliant writer on science, and that's the thing I find hard, is I still use adjectives and whatnot, and if you're a good science writer, you're not supposed to do that. It's all, but he's able to he's able to describe the world in a way that is very lyrical and poetic without using any kind of fakery, and I don't know how he does it. But I guess it's a kind of combination of being a sensitive person and yet having a scientific discipline. So that's the sort of thing I would very much like to do. But there are so many different collaborations that we can do, be it with scientists or with other artists. And Morag, you've done more than just work with other scientists, I think, or foresters.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, on the science question specifically, just started over the last few months. So this is in its very, very early stages. Hopefully doing a project for a local community. Well, it's sort of like a community / forestry and land Scotland forest over to the west of here. And that is with the same forester that I'm working with in Moffat, and a scientist called Petra Guy, who does soil science and is a mycorrhiza specialist. And the community group in the forest are giving us the space to dream up our ideal interdisciplinary project.
Wow.
So a forester, me, and Petra, who's the soil scientist. And I think we did our first R&D day, and I think we were still in that mindset that they want us to give results that we can show people and translate information and education for the community group. And then they said, that's all lovely. We really love what you came up with there. But what we want you two to do is work out how you could all do something really exciting that would help you grow professionally, creatively, and really use that true interdisciplinary kind of magic that happens when you all start talking across your disciplines, and see what comes out of that. So that's like really exciting, and to be given the space to think that up in the first place rather than someone tell you what you're going to do is amazing. So we're meeting again on Saturday, so that one will be I'm really excited about that. And yeah, I've done other collaborations with all sorts of people. I mean, some street artists. We did a rural mural project, so photograph. They were the kind of lead on the project, and they worked with me, and we introduced photography, but then translated that into these two huge street murals. One which was on like a 5-story building in Glasgow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the process of that and how they translate objects, shapes, colors, motifs, all of that sort of thing was just extraordinary.
How exciting.
I have to ask you, because I'm intrigued by it all, and I was part of trying to help a little bit with the Loch Arbour National Park. Are you going to be doing anything with your national park potentially?
We're trying to do a creative consultation right now, which will be historic, I guess, by the time this goes out, because the first one is on Sunday and the second one is the Sunday after.
Okay,
yeah. I mean, unfortunately, the tone of the debate around the national park has been really inflammatory and kind of hostile and very, very polarized. It's
very
been,
same here. Yeah,
to the point where there's lots of people who are just is really afraid to enter conversations about it. And of course, consultations tend to be quite, what would you call it, just dry and boring and not very accessible a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So, and Ted and I, are also, there's lots of other questions that need to come up about the future, regardless of a park or not. Like, how do we manage things for the environment and communities, and how do we set up fair governance structures with accountability and local representation? So we're going to lead. We've designed a questionnaire which is online, and we're going to lead 2 walks. where we've set up a set of questions that we feel hopefully seed really nice conversation, really productive conversation, and then we'll gather that back in and just put it into the consultation, but it also hopefully is usable going forward. And that's not actually a photographic project, I guess, but we've become because we do a lot of other work around the environment and local things and lots of volunteering. There's a big overlap now between when we're like working as artists or just working as community. So
as a matter of interest, when you do that, because I think that's such an interesting, as it were, byproduct of your artistic life, is that you're now consulted about aspects of governance and land management, and people care about what you think, as well as what you can do and what you can create. And I mean, just out of curiosity, do you get paid for that, or is that just always on a kind of voluntary basis?
That particular project is a commission, as a small, because there's a big move about involving arts and culture in everyday business, governance, politics, in every part of life down in the south. So we're lucky enough to have people who will commission bits of work like that. A lot of the work I do around forestry, and because a lot of it has sort of centered around forestry and land use change, actually, for me and communities, a lot of that is for free. Like, I would say like probably 75%, if not more, of what I do for that is free. But then, it's just so totally intersected with the, my creative life as well now, that it all just becomes one big kind of blur in a way.
And it comes with the territory, and it's not as if one should be sort of transactional about everything. Far from it. I was just curious, really, because it's great. I think that actually that local community groups benefit from your expertise and understanding. I think it's sometimes we all get siloed, in the world, don't we? And it's so tempting to say, well, this is a scientist's issue, but actually scientists increasingly, in my experience, seem to be mindful of the fact that there are things they can't do. They can maybe analyze and explain certain things, but they can't necessarily connect or share them effectively without an artistic input. And I think that, it requires these cross-disciplinary collaborations have got the potential to have great value. And it's actually really encouraging to hear that there seem to be now an increasing interest in using the in using the arts to help illuminate things that otherwise have a kind of scientific basis. National Trust, for example, when they're working on restoration, regeneration projects in my part of the world, they're usually using artists as well. Might be painters, sculptors, or photographers to help them to either get their message across or just to do something that will create engagement with the local community.
Yeah, I think just one on, and it is really encouraging that all of that's happening. But there is a bigger untapped potential there, which we're just starting to see creep in, which is thinking about arts and culture beyond illustration and communication and engagement, and actually, being one of the tools that helps people think differently and helps, sort of working our way out of the paradigm that we're all kind of stuck in at the moment in terms of, climate and environment. I mean, there's one really good concrete example down here, where there's it's called the Crichton Carbon Centre, and they work mainly around soil and peatlands. And they've actually taken an artist on now 2 days a week, I think it is, in a permanent role, not as an illustrator, as a communicator, but because the scientist person realizes how much having an artist in there changes the thinking and the potential for thought across the whole spectrum, like getting right down to the grassroots nuggets of ideas in the first place.
One of the things I noticed when I moved up to the Highlands here is that one is that local politics is very accessible. It's hard to avoid in many ways, and that goes through to environmental, and housing and everything else. But the environment is really an important part of that, and if you get involved in many of these activities, it's a lot of artists get involved in it. Whether that's because of the time they have available or the passion they have for the subject. But there's a lot of people doing important things.
Yeah, kind of crossing across the two things. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I don't know what it's like down in England, Joe, but it does seem, Scotland does seem pretty accessible. Yeah, from that point of view, as you said.
Yeah, I mean, Scotland does seem very idyllic in lots of ways. But having said that, we have a lot going on here in terms of the environment. Jenny is part of the local climate action group in our local villages, and I initially thought she and I were the only people in our part of the world who cared about these things, but that's just not true at all. And there's a huge number of people, both with scientific and artistic and academic backgrounds, who are doing their level best to try to change the paradigm, as you put it, Morag. And it's not easy to do, as you know. It requires probably more understanding of human nature and psychology than it does about arts or science, to be honest. Getting people to change their minds about things or to feel that they have a stake in the future. I mean, I've believed for 30 or 40 years, really, ever since I started working as a photographer and able to work with the National Trust back in the 1980s, that you could be part of a conversation about conservation, as I thought of it then. And that's only grown really since then. And I think that the arts are kind of critical. Nevertheless, I think it's easier in smaller communities to make a difference. So, Tim, I think that's what you're reflecting on there, really. And the fact that
easy to discover things, definitely, etc.
Indeed, and you're all more dependent on one another. I think of your village beside the loch, and you could be snowed in, or you are relatively isolated because you're not far from Fort William and not that far from Glasgow. But in landscape terms, the mountains separate you from the rest of the world, and the weather dominates your experience. South of the border, apart from maybe in the lakes, that's not really true anywhere. Well, that's probably people on the A66 wouldn't agree, but on the whole, further south you go, the landscape is just there. It's kind of more of a background, so you can get on with it most of the time. Having said that, flooding is increasingly a problem, as we're finding. I guess I feel that that probably all of us and many of the people listening will be very mindful and aware of this. We've all seen change through our lifetimes, and we're concerned because on the whole, people who look at nature, see those changes and love nature and want it to thrive. We're all interested in biodiversity, and we believe that the more we know and understand, the more we know that the mystery of the creation of the world opens up before us, and the more there is to discover. And it's all wonderful, and it's that lack of connection that's holding us back and holding society back from the change that we need. So to my mind, whatever we can do to help others without hectoring or lecturing, that's where we should be at.
Yeah. And I mean, there's huge benefits just for people on a personal level, never mind the biodiversity and the climate crisis, that connection and the wonder and the curiosity and the feeling, just generally connected to something bigger is so important psychologically and for people's well-being, I think.
Yeah.
We've all got kind of, I'm not saying all of us, but many of us, including me, definitely get into that kind of habit of like buying something or the next thing or looking forward to something, as opposed to sort of like staying really grounded in ourselves and in the moment and in our surroundings and really just enjoying being, in a time and place. So it's even if we're not looking at the bigger picture stuff, I think that's really important for folks.
Agreed.
I've got a question from David Mapleton. He says, I'm a 79-year-old and I'm a fan of landscape photography. I have a diploma from the Banff School of Art and have taught photography in Vancouver Night School for over 10 years. I'm finding recently that my admiration of any particular landscape photograph I happen to be viewing is being severely clouded by the influx of AI into nearly everything electronic and certainly photography. Manipulation at the output stage is nothing new, but I've always been able to recognize cooking in a photograph. But now I'm not so sure, and frankly, it is ruining my appreciation of a great capture. My question is, should I be conflicted, or should I just accept that AI is just another part of the photographical creative process? It's one of those AI questions, but a different take. Yeah.
Tim, you're probably even better qualified than me and Morag to answer this one.
Well, it's different people's take on it. I have a personal take on it, as you know, but I'm intrigued on whether there are AI is a polarizing thing. It seems the more you look at it, the more you can see advantages, but it will be exploited. In terms of the visually, I can see instances where it might be useful in what you're doing, potentially. Forgetting about ethical side of things, but I'm interested in what you think and what your experiences of it have been so far, Morag.
I've dabbled with a collaboration on it as part of a much wider. We were doing this was another artist residency last year, looking at nightjars. Looking at their migration and the risks to their habitat, because we have a local population here in the summer. And so we did a whole big wide range of things. Some of it was photography, some of it was cyanotype, some of it was cyanolumin, some of it was anthotypes on cloth. But one thing I did was a little picture where I collaborated with AI I took my own picture, maybe two pictures even, and then I described to AI this very meditative, reflective experience I was having of waiting on a bog for like 3 hours till the sun went down and the midges were there waiting for the nightjars, and then let the AI generate a picture of what I was seeing and feeling, and then put all the three pictures together, and then also asked it to write a meditation on the back. It had it as a little postcard. I think I probably just did that to get it out my system, just to say, like, I've had a look at that.
Yeah.
And,
You can't
just
talk about something unless you've tried it, can you? Yeah.
Yeah. And also because it is a really important subject to talk about, well beyond photography, of course, anyway. So I feel like it's important from that point of view. But then also, I don't know, because there's so much AI just in automated processing now anyway, isn't there?
Yeah.
Some of the automations that you can do as AI are AI. I have certainly seen other people saying they're really fed up because they can't tell on their newsfeed now whether something's a real photo or not.
Yeah.
But I think, as with almost, this would be my answer to any question is, do what you think's right for yourself at the time, and just don't worry about what other people are doing.
Yeah. It is difficult for people who are trying to appreciate photography, and this is one of our drivers for the Natural Landscape Awards in terms of authenticity. And the Wildlife Photographer of the Year
Oh yeah,
thought about it a long time about how do we tell how important it is, because it's getting so good now that it's you can create almost anything, and the control is.
yeah. So is it more a point about honesty and transparency as well?
I think that's what David
Questions getting
Appleton was
towards.
asking about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would just hope that would be a rule in a competition.
It should be,
And
I think. Now, I mean, I can see there are. I don't want to get into the ethical side of things because I have
Mm.
my own point of view. Whether the idea that AI is copying everybody else's art styles
Oh yeah, for sure.
is one thing, and I think that's a bit of a double-edged sword, because it's what we do as photographers quite often, reading books, but use our source material, and we look at social media and copy things essentially in a very similar way, according to how AI works.
What's social media?
What social media? Yeah, exactly. Just books for you.
Thanks.
But there is. I can see uses for it. For instance, if I was doing a project, let's say I was working on a microrhizome style project, I could, as part of that, work with an illustrator and spend a lot of time describing what I'm trying to create with an illustrator. It would cost a lot of money. It would be a collaboration, because I wouldn't be able to describe exactly what I wanted to see. And I couldn't keep on saying, well, no, I want it different than that, or I want to change it. So I can see aspects of AI being very useful in order to get somebody who isn't visually oriented or can't paint or draw to be able to create something that goes straight into what they're thinking and how they want to express. And you could say that in the way that photography did for painters, it lets illustrators be more creative with what they want to do and how they do it, so they can work at a higher level with things. It's a tough one, that one is, though, but I can definitely see an advantage in some cases.
I mean, my thought is, coming from originally from a commercial photography background, that commercial photographers will inevitably all use AI, whether they would like to or not, probably because it's so convenient and so powerful now. I'm not actually sure whether I ever do use AI, perhaps, Morag, as you're suggesting, almost by mistake, because it might be that Lightroom has a bit of AI that I'm not even aware of, or Capture One or Photoshop.
Yeah.
But when I go out with my camera, there's a difference. If I use a phone, it's brilliant at making pictures of difficult high contrast subjects, because it mashes pictures together, and you can do these sort of long exposures handheld, and it takes several pictures, mashes them together, and noise cancel. I mean, it's incredible technology. I'm not sure if that counts as AI or whether that's just computational photography.
Might be some in there, yeah.
But honestly, most of the time, I still think there's something about a straight picture, then it's sensitively edited, whether that uses AI or not, that allows us to connect with that emotion internally. But it's kind of catalyzed by the scene in front of you, and that's the photographer's kind of. I don't want to use the word genius, but when it works, when you get it right, and a picture is able to evoke something, I think it should feel real, and for me, that reality is quite important. I know that there's all sorts of ways of using photography that are not based on a strictly descriptive view of the world, but where it works, and that's the intention, any intervention from an artificial source is unwelcome, I would say. But I mean, who knows? It would be lovely. My main worry, to be honest, is less about how it affects photography, but how it affects human creativity more generally, and whether people will use it wisely, like Morag, or just be lazy and lose all their creativity in the process.
Yeah. And we were just talking about connection before, weren't we? And how important that is from multiple aspects. And if part of what makes one of VT's photos really beautiful or interesting or, provokes an emotion, is probably the connection that you were having in that place and time, and what you were feeling, what your mood was, what motivated you that day, what happened to catch your eye. And whether you have that same thing at the computer, I just don't know.
One of the reassuring things I think with about AI is it can only work with what's out there. So that because there are lots of photographs of, let's say, the Buccleuch of Moor, or there's lots of photographs of the Lake District, it can be very good at producing these long-range pictures of mountain ranges, etc. What it can't be very good at is doing things that it won't have. So, for instance, your microrhizome or your local area, it can't produce pictures of, because there's no source material there for it.
Yeah.
So I think that potentially the way photographers can now differentiate themselves is to do more personal work, things that aren't already out there in the mainstream. So it could open windows.
But it is, to go back to David's point, Tim, it is an interesting question, and I'm kind of sad for him that he's experiencing this crisis of faith, in a way, in photography, because I think that faith does come into it in a way, that sense of belief that you have in the reality of what you're looking at, and that you can believe it. I mean, I can't think of a better word for it, really. So it's a shame, but I'd sort of try to encourage him to keep the faith and hope for the best. I think there will always be photographers going out there with their cameras in whatever way, whether it's somebody who's creative as Morag or somebody who's relatively boring and stuck in their ways like me, doing what they do. So, and still, creating with no intent other than to be, use your natural ideas to come through. And I think that's ultimately very, very important. It's not that AI is no substitute for that.
I think David could do well instead of following a random stream of photographers, is pick photographers that have a good relationship with their subject matter and what they do, and so in other words, don't just look for pictures, look for photographers.
Yeah, don't let the algorithms decide for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that was a good question. Have you got any other good questions there, Tim?
I haven't got any more on the end of here, so you're going to have to come up with a question, Joe.
That won't be difficult.
Unless Morag would like to discuss the topic. I have an interesting question. If you, there is or has been in landscape photography an understanding that there's quite a bit of non-representation for women photographers. And we've looked at the number of people who enter our competition, and we think there's probably about 20%, 25% women to maybe 75, 80% men. That's in landscape photography. I know other genres it's different. But I've got friends who work as a couple together, and this was a while ago. But they had difficulty as a woman finding representation in women's photographies because they work with their husband or partner. And I was wondering how you negotiate that space in terms of if you're interacting with women's groups, or do you get seen sometimes as, oh, it's Ted and then Morag does some stuff as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting one that probably that did used to happen, I would think, but because we've diverged a little bit, so even when we're collaborating, we're maybe doing different things, it's not so much of an issue now. And I mean, there are some incredible women's groups out there. Just off the top of my head, I'm thinking of She Clicks. It's Angela Nicholson, if I get her name right. Yeah. She's got a huge kind of following and a whole kind of bunch of, I don't know how many tens of thousands it is now, but it's a lot of women, isn't it? In the world, obviously, of intentional camera movement and abstract photography that I spend quite a lot of time in, we haven't touched on that yet. There's a lot of women in there. I would say women outnumber men.
I would agree, yeah.
I can't imagine, but maybe flipping your ratio on its head, possibly.
Yeah, easily, yeah.
Yeah, something around that maybe. And I don't know if that's something about differences in the male and female psyche, but I come across a lot of women who've had quite a hard time, even just being in a camera club or whatever, just putting work forward that, I think, landscape photography, I hope I'm not saying this out of turn, so please challenge me if you think this is unfair or wrong, but it has had this kind of quite disciplined, strict, everything must be like this and it must be like this, and if you haven't done it like this, it's not right. And there's just been a real hierarchy to it all the time, hasn't there? Even in a small club, right up to the kind of national and international stage, and it's probably been harder for women to kind of break through in that, but in the same way that they have in all aspects of life, because we don't have equality yet, even now, even though we're very much closer to it than we were. And obviously we've got some incredible, well-known female photographers doing well now, which is obviously helps along the way, as well as having people like you who, celebrate, female photographers. So I don't know if I've really answered the question there.
No, it's okay. I mean, I'm intrigued in it because we've had conversations, and I know Matt Payne's had conversations about representation of women in our competition. It's been a lot of people have called for 50-50 representation on the panels, and we've done as good as we can, but it's difficult finding the people who have similar levels of representation. I think men are very good at showing off sometimes, and perhaps have a little more desire to build a following in terms of commercializing their work. I know we've seen that in some of the people we've looked at for judges. Whereas women, and this is a big generalization, it might have something to do with the intentional camera movement side of things, tend to be more experimental with the photography, tend to be more personal. And that sometimes doesn't do very well in a competition or a social media feedback way.
Yeah, because there's not much room for experimental, is there? Unless you just hit on the magical thing, like for that particular shot, and it works and it fits the brief of the competition. But there's probably a confidence thing as well there, I think. And again, generalizing, but men have typically been taught that they are confident and should be confident, and that's the way to go through life. And women haven't necessarily always had that. So it's probably a range of things.
Yeah.
And again, I do think it's improving and changing. And we are seeing leaps in photography from women who do come forward and do chuck the rule book out and experiment. Valda Bailey is an incredible example of somebody who came in, and she's certainly not, what was the word you said? Like that really driven, wants to.
It's like ego driven, yeah.
She hasn't got a great big ego that she's servicing from when I've met her. She's very, she's focused on what she does. She's very quiet and very gentle and very humble. And she managed to break through. And she was featured in your magazine really early on, wasn't she?
I love the fact that I don't think there are any male photographers who have got anywhere close to doing similar levels of work either.
And and she progresses it all the time as well, doesn't she? She gets to a stage and she works with that, and then you see something new come, and it's exciting and interesting. I mean, there's great male ICM photographers as well. I mean, Andy Gray strikes me as one who, another really nice guy. Sorry, what do you think, Joe? I think I've talked a lot there.
I'm really worried because I have a feeling I might be overly controversial. I mean, I personally have I've always tried to, when we had the gallery, to promote the cause of female photographers, mainly because I believe women are more naturally gifted than men as photographers, if I'm honest, and I've always felt that for decades. And I've never understood why. Well, I understand better, Morag, as a result of what you've said, and about confidence, because I think that is, men are probably encouraged to push themselves forward and to show off, as Tim put it. That's just part of the cultural differences. But I mean, if you look back through, with the great, looking back through the history of photography, for goodness sake, some of the most important photographers who've ever lived have been women. And arguably the greatest living photographer today is a woman, Sally Mann, or Annie Leibovitz. I mean, you could name as many. I think they've made much more difference to the world than virtually any male photographer I can think of. And so, I find the whole thing bizarre, if you're asking my opinion. I couldn't agree more about Valda, whose work I think is absolutely astonishing. I remember writing an article for On Landscape about 5 or 6 years ago, just in contradiction to somebody who'd written in to say that, actually I mustn't misquote them because it's not fair, but it was a provocative article that sent in, Tim, I don't know if you remember it, about how landscape photography was dead, or words to that effect, and that landscape photography was predominantly done by sad middle-aged men with beards.
You got a beard there?
I am. That's terrible. There you go. And I wrote back what I felt, I hope, was a constructive riposte, quoting yourself, amongst others, Anna Booth, I think, and Valda, and Lizzie Shepherd, and possibly Margaret Serrer, and others, as examples of brilliant female photographers whose work, was actually blazing a trail, creatively speaking, in terms of nature and landscape particularly, and that it, the idea that it was a moribund activity just struck me as being absurd. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but I just...
Sandra Bartocker as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So we have I don't think we're differing on this. It's just that we all have different perspectives on it, and I just find the whole thing baffling. It is frustrating. It has been frustrating for Tim, I know, to get female talent to come forward, to whether it's to judge or to appear more regularly. Even here in this format, it's, I think if we count the folk that we've spoken to so far, there's more men than women. It'd be nice if we could get a 50-50, but it's just harder to find people who are willing to be interviewed, actually.
It is interesting. I can probably count the number of men who have said no on one thumb. And I can count the number of women who said no to writing or interviews or talks on multiple hands.
On your feet, yeah.
Yeah, because
I think there will be a big confidence thing in that. And I know, like today, I think it was really nice coming into this for me. It's the first time I've done something like this where I haven't been stressed or terrified. And it's not just because I know you two, it's because I really feel grounded in what I'm doing now. I just feel like I'm not doing it for any other reason than I'm curious and it means something to me and it feels important. And I get excited when I see the results. And somehow that's turned me around from feeling very nervous and feeling like I don't know what I'm talking about, or I don't know enough about what I'm talking about, or will people say she's stupid, what's she going on about? That would have had me in terror for like the full 2 weeks running up to this.
Yeah.
And it's only quite recently, even though I'm however many years into this, that switch has come, I think.
It's strange, isn't it? It's that imposter syndrome, I think, is a big thing. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But if it's any consolation, I'd say that if you feel like you're an imposter, that humility is one of your superpowers, because I do think that it's an important quality to have. It means that you're constantly questioning what you do, and that you have the kind of groundedness to understand that we never know everything. We can't. That's not what it's about. It's simply if you're able to truly be yourself as an artist, however long you've been doing it, then you've probably got something worth saying, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, just what you've talked about there would be such a good thing to have a whole article about, and, and hopefully this conversation will help people. I mean, I heard, I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, even though he's so famous, Sebastian Salgado talk at Birmingham, probably, I want to say a few years ago, it's probably 10. And he just said that people are always looking at this end result and how do I be unique and how do I make my niche? And he's saying, just understand that the thing that's unique is you and your history and everything that came before you, right back to your ancestors, and you in that place in that time taking the photo is the unique thing. It's not like trying to magically find a niche that someone else hasn't already done. And because I do a lot of mentoring and coaching, and I think that's just such an important thing, that people feel valued and valid. And like you said, Joe, that it's almost guaranteed they've got something interesting to say.
That's so true. I mean, I think Tim, I can see time's drawing on. Just a couple more things I just wanted to run by in terms of Morag's work, because I think if anybody goes, I mean, you were saying that your website needs a bit of updating, but even if you go onto it now, that's the one that you share with Ted. You get insights into what you both do, but your core concerns still emerge from this deep passion for nature and an ability to sort of not see the world just through the lens of the camera, but to be able to go out and experience it with your ears and your body, your hands, and your whole being. And I think that, if you're living the life of an artist, that's really, really important to remember, even if in the end you use a camera to record a picture or translate it. And I just found that the number of different projects and ideas that you have, first of all, I thought it was quite overwhelming. I don't know how on earth you can manage so many things at once, but that's who you are, and I think it's a good example of, be driven by the things that you love the most. And then it really doesn't matter whether you feel you're an imposter or not, because you'll still go ahead and do it anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joe. I think you're right. It does come together because you are just, you're being the thing that moves and motivates you every day, as opposed to wondering what you should be, or having any concern about what someone else will think about that when you show it to them 6 months down the line. You just crack on and do it and kind of see what happens.
Yeah. Exactly.
I love that idea of being passionate about something changes the way you see it. I think and that is style at the end of the day. It's what you choose, what you love.
Yeah. And the big word for me over the last year or two, and it's even what one of the Forester project is curious conversations. And I think that curiosity, if you can keep that and nurture it and celebrate it and enjoy it, I think that's a long way. So it's kind of like keeping fresh and keeping enthused and motivated.
I think
it's curious, isn't it, that we get to this sort of age that I am now, like I've just got my pension, and what you're actually trying to do is go back to being a child again.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is that, as you say, curiosity is the word that we use now, but it's the same thing. It's that sense of wonder and excitement, and feeling that everything that you see is interesting because it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And celebrating that rather than, because I think some people can put childlike or childish into a negative space, the same way they can naivety or vulnerability. Ted and I were just talking about that this morning. Whereas all of those things are really, really important, and they're important to carry with you and keep with you. They're kind of gifts, aren't they, as opposed to, burdens or something that should be diminished.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Morag, and Joe again for a great hour session. We'll put links to your website on, which should have been updated by this time this go live, I believe.
Promise.
Thank you very much, and we'll see everybody again from the next podcast in a month's time.
Thanks,
Thank you very much for having me. Lovely to see you both.